Chapter 3100. This wastrel. Sooner or later he'll lose all his assets. Damn it, $1 million dinner, my heart hurts. Eat more, or else it'll be a waste of money. After eating until she was full, she felt that the life of a kidnapper was not bad. Fu Yuheng did not eat much, he just drank a few drinks and waited until she was full. He asked softly, "You have a big heart, what if the kidnapper poisons this table of food?" Although Wei Wei Bai was full, she still persevered and wanted to eat the last dessert. Hearing this, she did not know if she should spit out the fruit in her mouth. Her cheeks were puffed up like a hamster stealing food. Fu Yuheng laughed, "I'm just kidding, if I'm poisoned to death, there won't be any ransom." Wei Wei Bai swallowed the fruit, "Then it's fine if I'm poisoned to death." "Fu Yuheng, you're worthless to them." "Wei Wei Bai," Fu Yuheng calmly supported his chin with his hand, "but, you're worth a lot to me." "Wei Wei Bai, yo, this young man is really good at flirting with girls, so flirtatious." Fu Yuheng saw her blushing face, he felt that his attitude was too revealing. Maybe it was because the contrast was too big that it scared her. Because she was kidnapped, the time passed by in torment. Especially when she had eaten supper and had nothing to do, Wei Wei Bai felt that the night was long. The system had finished knitting the small hat, the big hat, and was embroidering. Since she had nothing to do recently, she went to pick up some embroidery jobs. After all, she could not just sit around and eat until she ran out of money. The income from the side accounts had increased a lot recently. She wondered if she had gotten familiar with digging holes. It listened to Wei Wei Bai chatter, "I'm bored, I want to see Ultraman fight the little monsters." The system was about to search. Then it heard her say, "But I can't watch, after all, Fu Yuheng is very sensitive, he'll notice if I'm spacing out for too long." The system said, "Then play with him and you won't be bored." Wei Wei Bai was so bored that she secretly yawned, not daring to let Fu Yuheng see it. He could remain so calm because the plan was in his hands. She couldn't. She was now a pitiful, innocent, and beautiful girl. It wouldn't make sense if he wasn't afraid or even felt sleepy. So she looked up and stole a glance at Fu Yuheng, who was sitting by the bed and deep in thought. He glanced at the time, as if he was predicting whether the ransom had been successfully negotiated. Occasionally, there would be shadows of criminals wandering outside the window. He glanced at her and immediately turned to look at Wei Wei Bai. Sure enough, he found the little girl wrapped in the quilt, squatting on the bed and staring at him. His eyes were black and bright, like some kind of pitiful little animal that was frightened. It was unspeakably adorable. He asked someone to send a feast and return the room. It was also a way to distract himself, so that she wouldn't focus on the kidnapping. After all, he didn't need to be afraid. She wasn't afraid, but that was impossible. Fu Yuheng was about to get up and comfort her. But he saw Wei Wei Bai suddenly jump up, wrapped in the quilt, and ran to the window. She closed all the curtains, then ran to the bed, her face red from the intense exercise. "Fu Yuheng." Her voice was trembling. "Will we be killed?" Fu Yuheng was silent for a while, and was about to say no. But he heard her say with certainty, "What if they kill us? This might be our last night." He pursed his lips, then said, "Won't." His sentence was cut off by the girl's sudden kiss. She pulled the quilt over her body and covered his head. This intense kiss was accompanied by ambiguous gasps under the quilt. After a while, her trembling voice came out from under the quilt. The girl's voice was full of unwavering drive. "If we're going to die tomorrow, you can have me, Fu Yuheng." Chapter 3101. The girl's breath had never been so strong before. It was as if she was carrying a sweet knife. The tip of the knife moved forward and stabbed into Fu Yuheng's mind. It made his mind blank for a few seconds. The ambiguous breath and the sticky sweetness. The girl sat directly on his body and pressed against his body. The white sheet wrapped them in a sealed environment. They were each other's breath. Her kiss was not even awkward. The sweet tip of her tongue pried open his lips and teeth. Like a seductive kitten, she used the tip of her sweet tongue to tempt people to fall into her pink hell. He let her do whatever she wanted. The corners of Wei Wei Bai's eyes were red under her eyelashes. Her eyes were like moist gems. There was a kind of reckless madness in the light. She kissed him. She whispered, "Fu Yuheng, you like me, right? Anyway, there is no tomorrow. Why don't you get me tonight?" This sentence was simply like a demon tempting a young angel. Although Fu Yuheng was not an angel. But at this moment, he looked like a fool. He was indeed stupider than an angel. The white sheet was still translucent. Under the dim blanket, his long eyelashes trembled slightly. He was almost suffocating. But he couldn't bear to part with her sweet kiss that made him completely immersed. When he teased her in the past, his high and mighty attitude made him look like a master even if he lost control. However, the young girl's arms were wrapped around his neck, and her burning passion made his skin crawl. His heart was beating like a drum. His muscles were trembling. It was as if he was controlled by her. She became his monarch, making him unable to move a finger. He could only accept her gift. He finally reached out and clasped her fingertips that went deep into his clothes. His hoarse voice was not persuasive at all. "Stop." He stopped her weakly. Wei Wei Bai narrowed her eyes. A dazed and irresistible kiss made the young man's cheeks turn red. A thought suddenly flashed through Fu Yuheng's mind. It made his blank mind suddenly wake up. Without any hesitation, the young man tore off the top of his head, using it as a blanket, and grabbed the back of her slender neck. With a pull, he successfully trapped her in his embrace. Then, his eyes turned extremely dangerous and dark. His beautiful thin lips were still wet, but he pursed them tightly. "Why is your kiss so familiar?" She was much more familiar with him. Where did she go to train? Bliss, who had been kissed by her until he was dizzy and disoriented, felt so comfortable that he almost collapsed. How happy he was just now was how angry he was now. Fu Yuheng's eyes darkened. "Have you kissed anyone before? Where did this kissing technique come from?" The feeling of jealousy was like a poisonous snake, making him feel like an exploding lion. He couldn't wait to eat her. Wei Wei Bai thought that she had succeeded in seducing him. After all, the little lamb Fu looked like he was a big boss, but he was actually a noob. In addition, the night was long and boring. If he didn't flirt with her, he would feel embarrassed. In the end, this guy's brain worked very quickly. He actually noticed that her kissing skills were too good and abnormal. He had been in such a hurry that he had forgotten to disguise himself. Sigh, what a miscalculation. She couldn't say that she had trained with Little Yellow Hair. In less than 2 days, Little Yellow Hair would probably be a corpse on the streets. Fu Yuheng saw that her eyes were flickering, as if she couldn't give a reason. He asked gloomily, "How many men am I?" Was the purity from before all an act? How many people had she provoked before this? Thinking about her mother's occupation, his face darkened even more. Chapter 3102. Murderous intent appeared on his face. He was even scarier than those criminals. Wei Wei Bai thought for a while and slowly frowned, as if she had just understood the meaning of his question. Her face slowly turned red, and the tears in her eyes shone with anger. The seductive kitten just now. She suddenly became a fierce tiger. She didn't care that her neck was in someone else's hands. Instead, she reached out her hands, grabbed the young man's collar, and pulled it down. She had a fierce aura as if she wanted to tear his clothes apart. Fu Yuheng, why do I have to report my love history when I kiss you? Are you afraid of AIDS? She sneered. Or do I have STDs? Do you want to go to the hospital for a full checkup before kissing you? No, you should draw a quarantine zone around you. Drag anyone who gets close to you for a checkup, in case they are sick and can infect you. She was mad. Her voice was almost roaring, and her aura was shocking. Her fingers were still pulling at his clothes. She looked like she wanted to die together with him. Fu Yuheng's anger and murderous intent just now was scattered by her. The cold deterrence that had always been useful to his subordinates. But to her, it was more like an accelerant. It turned her little temper into a big one. The kitten in front of him had turned into a fire-breathing dinosaur, wanting to spray him into pieces. Fu Yuheng pursed his lips, and his cold brows were still furrowed. He interrupted her word by word. He tried to snatch the right to speak. Your kiss, Wei Wei Bai mocked, is your kissing skill good? Why, if you like bad kissing skills, you should have said so earlier. Like last time, I can print the contract and type out all your requirements so that I can memorize them, so as not to offend you. Fu Yuheng, you, Wei Wei Bai, what about you? You are being unreasonable. If you like young girls, you should have said so earlier, you pervert. Fu Yuheng, Wei Wei Bai, brother, you are the best. Do you like this style? Or do you like me to carry a kindergarten bag and sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star for you? After saying that, she suddenly understood. Fu Yuheng, he finally understood what it meant to be unreasonable. This was the first time he had seen a girl being so unreasonable. Fu Yuheng, who had always dealt with mature people, was dumbfounded. That little bit of anger was turned into helplessness by her. He even wanted to let go of himself, tie her up with the blanket, and then cover her mouth with his hand. At this moment, Fu Yuheng, who looked like a boy who had just come of age, had a helpless look on his face. And Wei Wei Bai was still desperately pulling on his collar. What era is it now? Are you an old remnant of the feudal era? If you care so much about my kissing skills, why don't you ask me if I'm a virgin? These words were like a deadly blade. He pierced through Fu Yuheng's blood. He moved his lips and finally couldn't take it anymore. He lowered his head and kissed her. She was stunned. Then, with raised eyebrows, the young girl was unwilling to be outdone and fiercely kissed him back. The battle of lips and tongues began. Back and forth. It was a bloodbath. Her breathing was very messy, unlike the familiar seduction just now. Instead, he was at a loss as to what to do. They were utterly defeated. Fu Yuheng finally found some of his self-esteem as a man. He pinched her neck, loosely without much force, as if he was holding a kitten by the neck, with a kind of threat. But he didn't hurt her. He left her bright red lips, his long eyelashes lowered, and his eyes were as gloomy as the night. The young man's thin lips were also unusually red, with a seductive moist feeling. His voice was extremely low. If you change the topic again, I won't indulge you. T. Chapter 3103. Wei Wei Bai glared at him and snorted coldly. Fu Yuheng finally returned to the original question. You had a boyfriend before. Her kiss just now was too familiar and natural. This was not what he taught her. Wei Wei Bai looked at him from the corner of her eyes. Why? What do you want to do now that I have a boyfriend? Don't forget that I didn't want to sign that contract. If you think I'm dirty, you can terminate the contract. Fu Yuheng looked at her silently. His expressionless face started to be tainted with a hint of dark coldness. The gentle shell of the mask cracked. The dark side of the young man's heart was revealed. His fingers slowly stroked the back of her neck. Then he lowered his head and bit her ear gently. He gritted his teeth. It made her whole body stiffen. Only then did he let go of her slightly. His hoarse voice sounded in her ear. "You're so disobedient. If I terminate the contract, you'll be the one at fault. Your mom recently spent a few million yuan. Even if I give you a discount, you'll have to pay back more than 10 million yuan. If the contract is terminated, I want you to pay it back immediately." Wei Wei Bai was so angry that her whole body trembled. She sneered. "You're shameless. Fu Yuheng, I didn't spend the money. Or do you want to see how I force your mom to pay back the money now?" Bai Xiaoyu already knew that the Fu family's money was beyond her imagination. The recent expenses were even more shocking. She had completely treated Fu Qian as a black card ATM. If it was in the past, he would have reminded his father or adjusted the amount of living expenses he gave his father. Because he did not intend to have anything to do with the Bai family after a year. How rich his family was and what class they were. There was no need to let them know. But recently, he had started to give his father unlimited amounts of money. He wanted to spend as much as he wanted for that woman. He did not tell anyone about this dark scheme. Behind the indulgence, it was a threat. His little girl was still trembling in his arms. After all, that sum of money was really too much for her. Fu Yuheng's fingers stroked her fair neck down, his fingertips lightly touching her thin back. It seemed like he was comforting her. More like he wanted to control her. As expected, she tensed up even more, and her entire body stiffened for quite a while. Then he said in a low voice, "No one." Fu Yuheng narrowed his eyes. The gloom in his eyes was obvious. It was as if he didn't trust her. Then, he heard her mutter in a low voice, "Didn't you want to support me? I'm afraid you'll think that I'm not a social butterfly. After all, don't people like you need to be open-minded when it comes to keeping mistresses?" Fu Yuheng's breath was caught in his throat when he heard this. He was going to suffocate to death. He liked the idea of letting go of a ghost. Of course, before he could say it out loud, he heard her continue. "I have to practice anyway, so I found a lot of porn to watch. I even took screenshots to practice." Fu Yuheng, then, he slowly ground his teeth, and his voice seemed to come from the abyss. It was exceptionally gloomy. "How do you practice? Do you want to go home with someone and practice with a dirty towel?" That little yellow hair hit him too lightly. The girl was silent for a long time before she said embarrassedly, "Ice cream cone. What kind of name was that?" "Net name." Before the murderous intent in Fu Yuheng's eyes disappeared, he heard her speak again. "Just a lick and you'll know." "Lick it." Fu Yuheng's body stiffened. And since Wei Wei Bai had already said it out loud, she didn't feel burdened anymore. It's to study all kinds of kissing pictures and videos. Then, holding the ice cream and licking it before it melts. Fu Yuheng was finally sure. Chapter 3104. The ransom negotiation didn't seem to be going well. When Wei Wei Bai woke up, she saw Fu Yuheng knocking on the bed. His fingertips landed lightly on the edge of the bed. There was no sound, and he was unusually steady as he knocked on the bed bit by bit. The young man's lowered eyes were unusually quiet, and one couldn't tell that he was being kidnapped at all. His beautiful side profile was unusually pale. He noticed that she was awake. He leaned over and rubbed her hair. "Don't be afraid later." His voice was soft, and it was even gentle. Wei Wei Bai stared at him and was silent for a while before she suddenly said, "Are we going to be killed?" Fu Yuheng didn't expect her to say that. He was speechless for a while before he couldn't help but smile. "Do you hate me even more? After all, I was only going to kill me, but now I've implicated you. Wei Wei Bai rolled her eyes at him. Are you scared out of your wits? If I really die, I'll look for the kidnappers. They're the murderers. What does it have to do with you? You're a victim like me. If I become a ghost, I'll only harm those who killed me. Fu Yuheng thought that her words were cute. He couldn't help but tease her. If we're killed at the same time, I'll become a ghost like you and take revenge on those who killed us, okay? Wei Wei Bai frowned. You won't let me go even if you become a ghost? Fu Yuheng, then he thought about it seriously and nodded seriously. I won't let you go. Wei Wei Bai suddenly had a strange look in her eyes as if she was looking at a pervert. There's a reason why you're successful in business. You signed a sugar daddy contract. If you don't get your money back, you'll have to chase after the debt even if you die. After saying that, she yawned. Then she climbed out of the blanket. Her clothes were wrinkled, and her hair was messy. In this state, he could still take advantage of her verbally and gain some favorability points. He couldn't stand it if he leaned over and seduced her with his body. After Wei Wei Bai got up and tidied up her messy clothes, there was a sudden noise from the other side of the door. The gangster began to undo the faint lock on the door. Fu Yuheng suddenly reached out and grabbed Wei Wei Bai's fingers tightly. He seemed a little nervous. His palms were wet with sweat. Wei Wei Bai frowned and her face paled. She whispered, "Don't be afraid. At most, you'll be a good man again after 18 years. Fu Yuheng glanced at her indifferently and remained silent for a few seconds before replying softly. Yes. It was a simple reply. Surprisingly, it was soft and a little sweet. The door opened. The criminal was not wearing a mask, nor was he wearing a mask. Each and every one of them looked ferocious. One look and one could tell that they were murderers. Wei Wei Bai's face turned pale and her body began to tremble. Fu Yuheng knew what she was afraid of. After all, everyone knew that the criminal had no intention of covering his face. They would definitely not end up well. The criminal came over and scolded, "Hurry up and come out. Do you want us to invite you in?" Fu Yuheng, on the other hand, did not react. He was not afraid, nor did he respond. But his fingers tightened on Wei Wei Bai. The girl's fingertips were cold. She was too afraid. When the two of them walked out, Fu Yuheng finally could not help but lower his head and whisper to her, "Listen to me later. When I tell you to escape, don't care about me and run out directly." Wei Wei Bai's eyes went blank for a moment before she looked up at him. But she saw that the young man's exquisite jaw seemed to be a little tense. He pursed his thin lips. His lips were bright red. Although he looked good, it was obvious that he was not as carefree as usual. Save button. Chapter 3105. Instead, there was a hint of coldness. She looked at him for a few seconds, then pursed her lips and lowered her head without saying anything. But the trembling of her fingers slowly stopped. After they walked out of the door, they were brought to the abandoned hospital hall. The empty and dilapidated place was eerie, like a haunted house. More than half of the kidnappers were gathered here, and there were a few middle-aged men drinking tea. Fu Yuheng glanced at them indifferently. The middle-aged man saw him and sneered. "Young Master Fu, you've really broadened our horizons." They were all the people Fu Yuheng had fired and humiliated. They didn't have to come themselves. But although the other party said that they would pay the ransom, for the sake of the ransom's safety, the other party made the ransom very complicated. They were a small group and sent a few people to accept the ransom and count the ransom amount. This was also a necessary thing to do. Otherwise, these criminals were not to be trifled with. The ransom amount was shockingly large. They didn't take it personally. If the criminals came to pick up the ransom, it was possible that this group of people would eat each other up and swallow the ransom. And humiliating Fu Yuheng was not necessary. They could just sit in the car outside and wait for the ransom to come. However, these people were humiliated by Fu Yuheng, and they couldn't stand it. They wouldn't be satisfied if they didn't take revenge for this humiliation. Anyway, Fu Yuheng wouldn't live past today, so they might as well return the anger. It would also let Fu Yuheng experience their embarrassment and the pain of the company. So the few of them sneered and humiliated Fu Yuheng one sentence after another. You haven't even grown out your hair and you dare to go against us. You don't have the ability and you rely on your family background to suppress me. Are you worthy? Wei Wei Bai couldn't stand it when she heard this. She couldn't help but jump out and say something. Isn't this nonsense? The company belongs to his family. At most, you're paid to work in his family. Which worker scolds the boss? Are you worthy? Originally, everyone's attention was on her. It was all on Fu Yuheng. And Wei Wei Bai's existence was basically non-existent. When she jumped out, everyone took a closer look and felt that they were still a doomed couple. When Wei Wei Bai jumped out, Fu Yuheng couldn't help but frown. With a tug of his fingers, he hit her behind him. Then he said indifferently, I'm not worthy, but I hope that there's an uncle who can give me some face for my grandfather's sake and let me die with an intact corpse. His words indicated that he was admitting defeat. Immediately, the vengeful people at the scene were stunned. He felt much better. Moreover, there was no time to torture people today. It was enough to make Fu Yuheng admit defeat verbally and humiliate him. Where was Fu Yuheng's identity? Normally, he was also a person with high standards. They were not fools. They knew how powerful Fu Yuheng was. However, he was young, and there were too many obstacles. He was afraid that when he grew up, they would be in a much worse state than they were now. This was also the reason why they had to kill the hostage. They couldn't let this little tiger show its claws and grow into a big tiger. As for old Master Fu, he was already old. Even if he was a tiger, an old tiger was not scary at all. Killing Fu Yuheng was a must. The young man glanced at them indifferently. He was certain that there was not enough time and that the other party did not have any other ideas. Only then did he heave a sigh of relief. Clearly, all the plans were going according to his ideas step by step. If he was alone, he would not be so nervous. He silently glanced at the girl beside him. Chapter 3106. He saw her round eyes glaring fiercely at the people who humiliated him. The fear just now was replaced by anger. This little temper of his had even appeared. The corners of his mouth twitched helplessly. Seriously, she was not afraid of death. He silently took a step forward and blocked her, so that she would not be the first to be killed. The youth knew that under such circumstances, he should blame her for her rashness. But when she stood up, he did not know why, but his mood was actually a little soft and happy. Fu Yuheng felt that he would be infected by Wei Wei Bai sooner or later. His brain was going to degenerate with her. This was not a happy occasion. Those men were making phone calls again. It was a question of where to put the ransom and how to get it. Fu Yuheng narrowed his eyes slightly and remained silent. His fingers gently rubbed against the girl's fingers. The soft touch, the slightly wet feeling. It brought an excessive sense of intimacy. He liked this feeling, and it even made him calmer. Suddenly, the girl reached out her elbow and poked his waist. This was his sensitive belt. His body suddenly stiffened. But he heard the other party complain heartlessly, "Don't tickle my hand, it's uncomfortable." Fu Yuheng pursed his lips and did not say anything, but his fingers had stopped moving. Soon, the other party revealed ecstatic smiles on their faces. Quick, we got the ransom. The two of them immediately ran out. Their accomplice's car was already parked at the door. Two big boxes of cash were placed in the back seat of the car. They opened the boxes and immediately nodded, then closed the boxes. Then, they turned back and said to the dozen or so criminals, "Do it cleanly." Fu Yuheng looked up indifferently. His fingers suddenly exerted force and grabbed the girl's fingers. Wei Bai trembled and looked at him in confusion. But she saw that the youth's eyes had become cold and deep. His thin lips were tightly pursed. His fingers gently touched her fingertips again. It was as steady as if he was counting. Wei Bai's fingers were a little uncomfortable, but she did not stop him. She did not even move. Just as the two criminals rushed over and were about to separate them and execute them separately, Fu Yuheng suddenly said to the middle-aged men who were standing at the door and preparing to leave, "All of you have gathered together for this event." One of the middle-aged men turned around and sneered, "What? You want to take revenge on us after you die?" "To tell you the truth, all of us participated in this event, but what can you do even if you know?" Another cowardly accomplice immediately tugged at his sleeve. "Let's go. It's over. Our plan has succeeded." Fu Yuheng's expression was unusually cold. There wasn't the slightest hint of unwillingness before death. On the contrary, he was so calm that it was frightening. They glanced at him and didn't dare to look at him again. He immediately ran to the door. This time, the event had gone too smoothly. Everything was just right. Therefore, these people were careless and let down their guard. As soon as he stepped out of the door, a bullet had already penetrated the body of one of the middle-aged men. The attack came out of nowhere. It was simply beyond everyone's expectations. When the others saw this, they were scared to death and immediately ran back. But as they ran, another one was shot and fell to the ground. No one knew if he was dead or alive. When Fu Yuheng started shooting, he suddenly dragged Wei Bai and ran desperately toward the corridor of the hospital. More than a dozen criminals reacted at once. Slash. Chapter 3107. Wei Bai expended all of her strength on the way out of the hospital. Fu Yuheng's breath gradually weakened. His head rested on her weak shoulder, and he had already closed his eyes and fainted. The wound on his leg dripped blood all the way to the ground. If the system hadn't said that it wasn't life-threatening, Wei Bai thought that Fu Yuheng was going to die. After she used all her strength to drag Fu Yuheng out of the hospital, she realized that the matter was almost settled. Those kidnappers were all arrested one by one. She didn't even make it to the door. She was overwhelmed by Fu Yuheng. After all, no matter how strong a girl's body was, her strength was at its limit. She couldn't hold on with willpower alone. Her last impression was seeing a lot of people rushing in from the door. The system said that they were Fu Yuheng's men. Wei Bai fainted in relief. Fu Yuheng was still on her back. He was so heavy. He didn't look fat, and his muscles weren't scary. Why was he so heavy? It was probably because of his high bones. When she fainted, she was still thinking about Fu Yuheng's weight. He continued to sleep, and continued to sleep. Then, she had a strange dream. There were bones all over the ground, and a lonely throne. The man sat on the white bone throne, and his fingers landed lightly on the rusty sword beside him. His beautiful golden eyes were half closed quietly, and the golden light was flowing. It was unusually gorgeous. Compared to the previous dream, there was a hint of gentleness and softness. Wei Bai saw this dream again and frowned strangely. After all, it was a dream repeatedly. Even she felt that something was amiss. She looked at the bones all over the ground and couldn't help but tiptoe forward step by step. The man who looked like Yi Yuxuan was still sitting quietly. He must be asleep. Wei Bai didn't have any defenses and just walked over. Suddenly, she felt something tighten around her wrist. Looking down, she saw a red string wrapped tightly around her wrist. The feeling of the red string cutting into her flesh was unusually clear. It was so clear that it hurt a little. Because of the pain, she couldn't help but reach out to touch the red string, wanting to loosen it a little. His fingers had just touched the red string. A powerful force pulled her forward. This power came too suddenly. Bai Weiwei's footsteps staggered. His entire body had already pounced over. Originally, there was still a long way to go before they reached the throne, but because they had jumped, they ended up in the arms of the golden-eyed man. The top of her head bumped into his chest. It was cold and hard. It was almost like knocking into a block of ice. Her fingers quickly grabbed the other party's clothes. The clothes were very tough, and she didn't know what material they were made of. Her breathing paused. She felt that the other party was too cold, similar to the temperature of a corpse. It was too real. It didn't seem like a dream at all. It felt more like real. Just as this thought surfaced in her mind, a hand suddenly landed lightly on her waist. Wei Bai's body trembled as she was lifted up and placed on the other party's lap. Her face was forced to press against his chest. The other party didn't seem to have a heartbeat. Although she was confused, Wei Bai still felt that this was a dream. And dreams were all kinds of messy things. It was normal for a person who could move to not have a heartbeat. She was just wondering why she kept having the same dream. And the texture of this dream was too strong. And that hand was already lightly touching her shoulder, the fingertips touching her hair. Chapter 3108. Wei Bai looked up and saw the cold and calm man who was like an exquisite puppet. There was still no fluctuation in his dead eyes. But his fingers did not stop. Instead, they passed through her hair and touched her face. Her soft cheeks made him feel a little pain when his fingers lightly touched them. She frowned and was about to avoid it. But that hand had already stopped. Then, it curled up slightly and did not continue to touch her. It was as if it was afraid of breaking her. Wei Bai finally realized that something was wrong. This pain felt too real. It did not feel like a dream at all. It felt real. A trace of doubt flashed in Wei Bai's eyes. But she saw that there was an ugly doll hanging from his wrist. The doll was densely wrapped in red threads, and the place where the red threads were connected was the man's beautiful unfair wrist. And on the other side of the red threads. She raised her hand in a daze and saw that the red thread on her wrist was the same as his. They were connected together. No matter how slow Wei Bai was, she still realized that something was wrong. And that ugly doll looked like her no matter how she looked at it. The doll was ugly because it was wrapped in red threads. It was like a terrifying binding, and it looked abnormally scary. But those facial features were cute and perfect. They were exactly like her face, her realistic face. It was just a little cue. Wei Bai had a bad feeling in her heart. After all, this was a dream that was so scary that it was close to reality, and she saw such a scary thing. Who wouldn't feel strange? Suddenly, that hand landed lightly on her back. It landed especially gently. It was too careful. Then, Wei Bai saw the man who was hugging her lower his head slightly. Under his long eyelashes, that pair of golden eyes had opened completely. The man's thin red lips were pursed slightly. But he was silent. In the land of bones. The man's eyes were clear and empty, but they were also perfect. He was the perfect version of Yi Yuxuan. But there were too many emotional fluctuations. Originally, she thought that Yi Yuxuan was enough of a robot. Now, this could not even be called a robot. One could even say that he was a gem that lived as long as the heavens and the earth. It was sparkling and beautiful, perfect and resplendent. There was no sign of life. The atmosphere was lifeless. It was even more lifeless than that pile of bones. And this breathtakingly beautiful gem was already close to her cheek. He was not breathing. He stared at her quietly, as if he was examining something. Wei Bai felt a huge pressure that made her unable to move. This kind of pressure was enough to make her soul tremble. She had transmigrated through so many planes. Logically speaking, she should not have such an obvious sense of fear. After all, he had encountered all kinds of weird, perverted, and insane things. There was no reason for a simple stare. He could make her feel cold from head to toe. The man looked at her quietly for a while and raised his other hand. The red thread wrapped around his wrist. The contrast between red and white had a tragic and gorgeous feeling. Wei Bai really wanted to dodge. However, he found that he couldn't move at all. It was as if he had become a poor little hamster in a huge cage. There was nowhere for him to run. His fingertips had already reached the top of her head. Just when Bai Weiwei thought the other person's fingers would fall on her hair. In the next moment, his fingers continued to move up. Wei Bai couldn't help but look up and see a shocking scene. Above her head, in a very distant and high place, the fog was thick and rolling. And the outline of a round golden object was faintly discernible in the rolling fog. To facilitate the next reading, you can click on Chapter 3109. It was very far away. But she could see that huge outline. If someone with a phobia of gigantism saw it, their scalp would go numb. Just that one silhouette made Bai Weiwei feel a sense of deterrence and an incomparably terrifying heaviness. Her breath stopped. And the man raised his finger, but elegantly and lightly bent it. As if he was hooking something, unusually casually, he pointed it down. This point. In the rolling haze. That huge outline actually began to sink. Breaking through the black haze, the behemoth's round will appeared above their heads. Golden feathers of light fluttered down. They sat in the golden feathers of light, as if they were in a golden heaven. The man was still sitting quietly, his body was still like a silent stone, not moving at all. The only thing that moved was his hand. That huge golden wool was close to the point. Only then did Bai Weiwei see clearly that it was a machine-like clock made up of countless precision objects. It was just a form. Because it was more than any clock in the world. It was beautiful. Huge. Complicated. Countless patterns of the sun, moon, and stars, and countless complicated spells. A huge number of complicated patterns that had almost never been seen before. They combined to form this terrifying and beautiful clock wheel. Among the countless golden feathers, she saw the needle of time in the middle of the wheel. In the vast expanse of gold. A touch of red was wrapped under the needle, as if it was preventing it from moving. Her eyes couldn't help but look at that red. And in the next moment, that red suddenly and gradually collapsed. The man's fingers suddenly clenched. When the red collapsed, it emitted a shocking red firework. It was like a firework. Those red firework were instantly swallowed up by the golden light. Not a single trace was left. Wei Bai was stunned, feeling that this scene was too beautiful, too shocking. She slowly blinked her eyes and was about to say something. The man had already gently rested his chin on her shoulder. Then she heard an unusually calm, soft sigh. He seemed to want to say something. In the next second, she heard it. The system's roar. Wei Bai. His voice was so loud that it was frightening. Bai Weiwei's body stiffened, and her eyes opened. He saw the ceiling of the hospital. Her mind was muddled, and her ears were ringing. She felt that her beauty had been shattered by the system's call just now. She paused for a few seconds before asking, "What's wrong? Are you trying to make me deaf?" The system said, "No, I saw you sleeping until you were snoring and drooling. I also saw the male lead beside you, so I was worried that your snoring and drooling would ruin your beauty and cause your favorability to drop, so I woke you up." When Wei Wei Bai heard this, she couldn't care less. She hurriedly wiped her mouth. Damn it, that little fairy snores when she sleeps. It was impossible for her to have snoring. If there was an illness, it had to be treated. She immediately turned to look, only to see Fu Yuheng lying on the bed next to hers, fast asleep. One of his legs was in a cast and hung high. It seemed to be quite serious. There was also a medical bandage on his cheek, which seemed to be a scratch. She glanced at Fu Yuheng and found that he was definitely not awake, and he didn't see her snoring either. She then let out a sigh of relief and looked at herself. She saw that although she was also lying on the bed, her hands and feet were intact, and her face was fine. At most, it seemed that when she fell, there was a scratch on her elbow, and she had also applied medicine and bandages. Chapter 31:10. Compared to the miserable state next door, she was basically a perfectly healthy person. Wei Wei Bai adjusted the pillow and said to the system, "I had a very realistic dream just now. I thought my soul had transmigrated again. That dream just now was too realistic. So realistic that she felt that something was wrong." The system was silent for a while before saying, "It's just a dream." Wei Wei Bai heard his tone, her eyelashes drooped slightly, and a trace of gloomy doubt appeared in her eyes. But she didn't show any other emotions. She just responded faintly, "Yes, it's just a dream." Was it really just a dream? Wei Wei Bai closed her eyes expressionlessly, but she didn't fall asleep. But that dream was so clear that it seemed to be in front of her eyes. Not a trace of fading. And when the system saw that the host didn't seem to continue to pursue the matter, it silently put away its megaphone. Just now, her soul had entered the land of bones. No, it should be the land of bones. It had spread into the plain world. In the past, Yi Yuxuan's divinity just quietly stayed in one place and didn't move. But recently, his land of bones had started to spread. Little by little, it followed the red line and spread to the host. The system looked at the red line on the host's wrist, flipped through the tools, then reached out its little hand and began to grind the red line. It didn't break the red line. This divinity pulled the host to the land of bones every day. Sooner or later, she might not be able to come back. If it hadn't yelled at her to wake up just now, she probably didn't even know that her body was about to die. After all, the soul had traveled so far. The body couldn't hold the soul, it was equivalent to a corpse. As it was grinding, it suddenly heard Wei Wei Bai, whose eyes were closed, say softly, "Tongzi, there's something on my wrist." The system's body stiffened, and its movements also stopped. The red line on her wrist was too obvious. Could it be, the host actually saw it? Then it heard the host say, "It looks like a red line, do you see it?" The system stiffened for a long time before replying, "No, no." Its tone was too chaotic, it felt that the host knew that it was lying. In the end, Wei Wei Bai slowly opened her eyes, there was no hesitation in her beautiful eyes. She said calmly, "Well, if you say no, I believe you." These words were said lightly, but the system was stunned for a long time. The corners of his mouth twitched, and he finally lowered his head in a daze, a trace of helplessness appearing in his round eyes. His hand remained stiff for a long time before it finally moved. He began to persist and work hard to continue cutting the red line. He had to leave Yi Yuxuan after gaining enough HP. A person like Yi Yuxuan would never be destined to have a red string of fate. This red line was the result of him using his own luck to forcibly connect the innocent host. Once the host's HP was full, then, he would begin to suffer Yi Yuxuan's backlash. He would use his immense luck to draw away the life in her that was similar to his. It was as if he was a huge black hole. And the host is just a small strawberry beside the black hole. If it weren't for the fact that the black hole was in a deep slumber, and the power of love was used to forcefully stop the operation of the black hole's power, this strawberry had long been swallowed and crushed. There was no chance of survival. And he had to stop the operation of this power before it could stop the operation of this power. After snatching enough HP, he would take her away from the black hole that was Yi Yuxuan by hook or by crook. He couldn't take the risk of letting the host lose her life again. Suddenly, he heard the host whisper, "Is Fu Yuheng disabled?" The system almost reflexively replied, "No." /quick. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.